of maybe the maturity of the project. So we might start with Sarah to introduce your project and take about 5 minutes plus or minus to sort of give us the background of where you are in that project and a little bit about it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Janet. So I'm here representing the Lake Tahoe West Restoration Partnership, and thanks, Janet, so much for inviting me and organizing us on this panel. I am Northern California Program Manager with the National Forest Foundation. I am based in South Lake Tahoe, and that's where I also serve as Project Manager for Lake Tahoe West. Let me actually, can I share my screen? Yeah, I should be able to do that. Okay. So there, you should all be able to see a nice slide of a pre-COVID field trip with some of our Lake Tahoe West partners. So just a quick word about the National Forest Foundation. We are a national nonprofit chartered by the U.S. Congress to engage Americans in promoting the health and public enjoyment of our national forests. We do a lot of things, but part of our work is through our Conservation Connect program, where we serve community-based groups and Forest Service staff who are engaged in collaborative forest management efforts throughout the country. And so through that program, we provide facilitation services, process design, we host peer learning sessions, and we disseminate collaboration tools and best practices. So it's through that Conservation Connect program that we've been involved in Lake Tahoe West since 2016 as one of the conveners and as one of the facilitators. So Lake Tahoe West, I'm sure many of you have heard of it at this point. It's a collaborative effort to restore the resilience of forests, watersheds, recreational opportunities, and communities on 59,000 acres of the Tahoe Basin. It's about a third of the basin, and it includes federal, state, and private lands, primarily federal. I'll say just a little bit more about that in a sec. First, I want to note that, we define resilience as resilience of those values to climate change, wildfire, drought, and insect and disease outbreaks. The primary landowners on the landscape are the Forest Service Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit, the California Tahoe Conservancy, and the California State Parks. So those are some of our main agency partners. The Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, the Tahoe Fire and Fuels team are also heavily involved. And I'll say that the agency partners have really been the active drivers of Lake Tahoe West in a lot of ways. And then we've also had active engagement by tribes, mainly the Washoe tribe, and a number of stakeholders that include local and regional conservation organizations, fire protection, recreation community, homeowners, businesses, scientists, and local government. So in terms of how we're defining our goals for Lake Tahoe West, we articulated them, I think, nicely in our landscape restoration strategy. And I won't read through all the goals, but it's something you'll note as you scan through them is that really there's a focus on multiple benefits. It's not just protecting communities, although obviously that's really important, but it's also wildlife habitat and clean water and lake clarity and watershed and stream health, meadow and aspen restoration, carbon benefits, and a strong local economy. So it's really framed pretty broadly in terms of the goals of the project. And some of the key principles are coordinated cross-boundary landscape scale management that's informed by science and modeling, much of which was done specifically for Lake Tahoe West, and all within an adaptive management framework. So I think this is my last real substantive slide. Just to give you a sense of where we're at in the project, it was designed as a 5-phase project. We started with a landscape resilience assessment that was completed in 2017. And that helped us kind of agree on what we wanted to be resilient on the landscape and how we were going to measure that, and helped us get a common understanding of the current conditions. Put together the landscape restoration strategy, completed that in 2019. And we're currently in the project planning phase. And I think you all are getting started kind of a couple phases, from our perspective into it. I think from what I read, you all are launching into that project planning phase much sooner than we did for Lake Tahoe West. So that's exciting. for Lake Tahoe West, our planning document is making sure that kind of the rest of the landscape is covered. We already have a number of projects that are being implemented in the Lake Tahoe West footprint. So the Lake Tahoe West environmental document that we're doing right now is kind of making sure that the rest of the landscape is covered. And then next steps are going to be permitting and implementation for that work that we're currently planning. And then of course, we're also working on a monitoring plan. So I think that's primarily it. I'll keep my comments now short, and I look forward to the discussion.
Janet, you're muted.
Boy, someday I'll figure that out. Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that. We'll go ahead and go to Brett. I think you're sort of the next step into the project. So go ahead and introduce your project, Brett, and then we'll go to Neil as third step.
Okay, I think you guys have my slides.
Yep, Kelsey.
You put up the first one, I'll let you know when to turn. So my name is Brett Storey. I work for the County of Placer. Actually, before Sarah joined, I used to be on the Lake Tahoe West Science Advisory Committee as well, but my project started and I just could no longer spend the time up there. I've been doing this for about 15 years. Prior to that, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. I was a computer manager. I was an aerospace designer as well. But the last 15 years, I've been working on forestry projects. I also do hydroelectric power projects. We have a partnership with our local water agency, and I do groundwater plan development. So if you could put up the first slide. I'll wait for that. Oh, the project's name is the French Meadows Watershed Health Project. And it's actually about 30 miles from where Sarah was talking about in Lake Tahoe. It's as the crow flies or as you snowshoe. There's no road to get out there from that side. But it's one of our paired reservoirs that we bring water down to the entire region down below, including out to the Delta. And on the right, you see our partnership picture, obviously pre-COVID, and we've got a variety of partners. So next slide. So that's just a picture representation of where we are. Lake Tahoe is just off the map to the right. And then that's just a description of how our water system works with all the tunnels and dams and powerhouses. Next slide. So our project was one of those projects our Forest Service Ranger District had that sat on the shelf for decades because they don't get enough money to do all their projects. Well, it's actually our hydroelectric power and water facilities surround this area. And so we became concerned after a large fire in our area. So we actually went to the Forest Service and said, we'd like to help. We have money, we have expertise. Would you let us? And they said, absolutely. We've been working with you on small projects for a while. Let's tackle a big one. So this one is 22,000 acres. The partnership includes the county, the water agency, the Forest Service, the Nature Conservancy, the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, both from a funding and an expertise background, and the University of California, Watershed, because we're doing some water research as well. It's a 5 years on the ground mechanical handwork via our master stewardship agreement with the Tahoe National Forest. And then we have another several years of prescribed fire should we be able to do that. That's been a little tough given all the fire conditions. And we are just about to start. In fact, I had a meeting with our loggers Monday. We're going to send them in 2 weeks. The snow's melting so fast because they got caught in a snowstorm last year and still had 700 logs on the ground. So they're going to start shipping those out. And we remove and utilize both timber and biomass, although it is at a significant loss. The cost of the project's about $16 million. We'll likely raise about $4 million off the timber and biomass, and the rest is grants and our own dollars from our own boards. And then there's another 10,000 acres of private checkerboard land also undergoing thinning operations in the surrounding area. So that was part of our partnership as well. Next slide. There's the partners and their roles. Essentially, we worked with the Forest Service and we actually performed a lot of the NEPA. We hired many of the consultants. We worked as a team to design it. And and they were happy to have our help, and it's worked out. Again, we've been working with them for about 15 years, so that plays a big role. That you obviously have to gain trust with each partner. And then you see some of the other partners of what they do. We've also been fortunate, and we've been able to get, via the Nature Conservancy, some private donations from a lot of beverage companies, both soft and hard beverage companies. And so that's helped us. Next slide. So this is our project timeline. We were pretty fast because we have about $4 billion of infrastructure in that area, and we did not want to see it go up in flames, including transmission lines and the ability to generate power. And so in 15, we aligned with multiple partners to define the project. We started our studies in 16. We started getting money. We did the formal process. The end of 2018, we had the NEPA and CEQA concluded. We had 2 full years of funding already secured, and plans and agreements were all developed and approved by our board to hire contractors. In 19, we went in with contractors and we did year 1 operations, which I'll talk about here in a sec. And then, well, this one, year 2 planning began. Then we just rolled. Each year we've continued to secure more money and to hire contractors and get moving. Next slide. And here's kind of the update of where we are. The first year we were only able to get about 1,000 acres, but that was okay. You'll see we did over 3 million board feet, because what we chose to do was work from the fire danger zone, i.e. where humans are, the campgrounds, and we worked out. And so some of those areas hadn't been touched in decades. But it took longer. So we did about 4,000 tons of biomass. We improved 18 miles of road, and we did that because it's not just, forging new roads. These were existing roads that were in bad shape. The runoff was causing problems with Meadows and with water quality. So we wanted to actually do that improvement with the Forest Service. So that we got that done. We hired over 80 local contractors, and then we had another 10 for project layout, tree marking, etc. Then last year we came around and we doubled it. We did a little over 2,000 acres, but we only got 2.2 million in board feet of timber. We had anticipated doing 3,000 acres and 3 or 4 million in board timber, but this is one of the problems you have in this state, and really all states in the West. We were asked to shut down by the mill who we were delivering materials to, because they were trying to harvest all of the dead wood from all the fires before it was ruined. And so we absolutely said, sure, we get it, we understand. The other factor was because of fire conditions. A lot of times we couldn't work past 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock during the day because of EVA restrictions from the Forest Service. So we were, while we doubled our acres, we were a little bit bummed because we wanted to do more. And so the net result of that is we've added the 5th year to the project. We were originally going to do it in 4 years. And do I have one more slide? I can't remember.
I think that's it.
That might be it. Okay, I'll end there.
Great. Well, I think the lesson there is you still made good progress, and you got better, and you should be even. I guess
I'm a project manager. I was ticked. I had a schedule to meet.
I understand.
And now I'm retiring, but they're bringing me back to help them still. But
that's great. Thanks, Brett. And then we'll go next to our last panelist, Neil Chapman, and he'll give us a little background about the project he's working on.
All right. Let's see, I've got just a couple pictures. So let's see. Can I share my screen? Is that?
Yep, you should be able to share your screen. I made you a co-host.
Here we go. Got it. Yep. Okay, so Neil Chapman here. I'm the Forest Health Supervisor for the Flagstaff Fire Department and Summit Fire and Medical District. I've been in this position since October 2019. And previous to that, I worked for the Nature Conservancy in Illinois and Northern Arizona for 15 years in about 5 different positions. So relatively new to this job. So both of the projects I'm going to talk about, I was not directly involved with at the start, but I've been involved with quite a bit from the sidelines until jumping over here with the city. So it's a little unique that we have a wildland fire management program within a municipal fire department, but it's really well aligned to address the actual needs of our community. Our wildland fire management program mission is to protect Flagstaff and its priority watersheds from the effects of catastrophic fire. Our vision is a community where Flagstaff thrives due to the Wildland Fire Management Division's unique skills, knowledge, and abilities within wildland fire operations, forest management, firewise development, and wildland urban interface code enforcement. So we have 5 full-time staff and a 12-person seasonal crew, and every single line firefighter in Flag and Summit is a minimum FFT2 qualified. So same story that you guys are dealing with. Arizona's forests have changed. We went from this picture above with an open canopy, fire adapted forest, to this lower picture. These are about 100 years apart, just outside of Flagstaff.
Hey, Neil, I can't see your screen, and I don't know if others can, but you might double check that you hit that green screen share button at the bottom of the Zoom screen.
Let me try again.
That looks better. So yeah, we're not in presentation mode, but we can see your first slide. There you go.
Well, we missed the first one, which is super pretty. So I just wanted to show that. So, you know, Flagstaff, just a little more background. We're at 7,000 feet in town. We have the largest continuous ponderosa pine forest in the world surrounding us. And this is the change we're dealing with over the last 100 years due to fire suppression. So we had open stands, you know, 40 to 60 basal area per acre, changing completely to closed canopy forest, fire return intervals in our ponderosa pine and dry mixed conifer 3 to 7 years, basically about as frequent as you can get. And lots of cultural burning as well. And a statistic I like to talk about when we see how important fire is in our landscape. Wally Covington from the Ecological Restoration Institute, you know, we were on a field trip once and he kind of got this story going where this forest is over 10,000 years old, basically a relic of when the Pleistocene started transitioning to a warmer time. So over 10 to 15,000 years, our forest has been growing as this ponderosa pine and dry mixed conifer forest. And we turned fire off for about 100 years, and that was all it took. So 100 years out of well over 10,000 years, and the structure completely changes in a way that puts it at risk of catastrophic fire. So forest has changed, and we had some big management action points that I've got some information we can get into later when we talk about some lessons learned and triggers. But basically our 2 big solutions right now, we've got the urgent need to act statewide to try to reduce catastrophic fire effects, known as the Forest Restoration Initiative. This was one of the original CFLRP projects from back in 2010. It's a 2.4 million acre landscape. So I like to say it's a big landscape with a big NEPA and big contracts. And we are not a model of saying that big fixes everything. And so the first analysis area was about 1 million acres, had about 600,000 acres of timber harvest NEPA, about 500,000 acres of prescribed fire NEPA. That was completed back in 2015 and signed off. In 2013, a large timber contract of 30,000 or 300,000 acres over 10 years was awarded. That contract has cut less than 30,000 acres since then. So very underperforming contract, even though it was the largest awarded contract in the history of the Forest Service. The first NEPA was basically around the Flagstaff area. The second analysis is taking place right now, and that's moving across our rim to the east, more on the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. That's again, same kind of scale, 1 million acres, lots of timber, lots of fire, and the NEPA is coming together just fine. You know, I think most of the stakeholders at this point are in a position where they understand the give and take process of the collaboration, and you know, lessons learned again, we'll get into later, but I think we all understand how to compromise at this point on the things that we are okay to compromise on. And then we had more of an urgent need to act locally. And so this is where the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project came into play. And through the city here, I'm the manager of this project. It's collaborative with the county and the Forest Service and a bunch of other partners. And so this came in 2012 in the form of a city bond. So this was a $10 million bond with an estimated 10,000 acres to be treated. It was passed by the city of Flagstaff voters at about 74%. So very strong buy-in from our community to do this work. In 2010, just a year and a half earlier before this was initiated, the Schultz fire burned up some pretty hot acres right above a community, and we had some big impacts from that. So there was a lot of understanding that we need to invest up front in this work and prevent those impacts as much as we can. So there was two main focus areas, or I guess three, of the Watershed Protection Project. It was this area called the Dry Lake Hills, directly north of Flagstaff. So a 2 million acre forest, something like 80% of the recreation takes place in that area. Within city limits as well, this money was available for doing treatments within the city. And then the Upper Lake Mary watershed is where our surface water comes from, out of a reservoir. And so there was treatments on the side of some steep slopes right next to that watershed that were a part of the project as well. So that was 10,000 acres, $10 million bond. It wasn't exactly $1,000 an acre because some steep slopes, we were looking at spending $5,000 to $10,000 per acre. It funded a fire crew within the city here doing a bunch of chainsaw work on certain acres as well. So the money went to Forest Service contracts, it went to city projects, it went to state projects. It really was a really diverse program. We were able to leverage some of those projects on state land and city land with grants. And then the Forest Service did all the NEPA, and then they've been managing the implementation. So the prep, the layout, the timber sale admin, although the city has played a very close role supporting that, the Forest Service had full responsibility in all of those projects. So that's kind of our story. We've got the Fry project that is supposed to build the industry investments for us. The Watershed Protection Project that was designed to fill in the gaps where the industry wouldn't be hitting. So some of these steeper, more complex acres. But the reality is that Fry isn't building the industry we would want, so our costs are skyrocketing for even regular acres, never mind the steep slope acres. And we did not get to treat 10,000 acres with the original $10 million. So we got all the city acres done and the majority of that Dry Lake Hills area, but the municipal reservoir, we have not been able to stretch that money into those acres just yet. But we're working on it. The FWPP project has been matched about 1-to-1. So for almost $10 million in city costs, we've had about $10 million in partner contributions, whether it was Forest Service match, grants, or other organizations supporting it as well. So I like to think the big picture for us, we're really trying to turn this billion-dollar challenge. I mean, that's really what it is. Billions of dollars, if we don't do something now, are on the table, into safe communities, healthy forests, clean water, and good jobs. So I'm sure it's similar to what you guys are in. If we can get these fire adapted restoration treatments completed, it's a win-win for everybody. There's really nothing that can go wrong with these treatments as long as we get something on the ground. There is no such thing as a perfect treatment, just something that keeps it in a natural state so it doesn't burn down. We can always get in there and argue about perfecting treatments later, is kind of a story I like to say. We can argue about that later. That'll be somebody else's problem. For now, it's kind of emergency management. So let's just keep it from burning down. So that's all I've got for slides until a couple things we can get into later. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Neil, can you tell us where you are timeline-wise in the project? Just like what year of implementation are you guys in, and when did you start your planning?
Sure. So Fry is a different definition of implementation, because as soon as Fry began, the documentation of acres treated, basically anything that was shelf stock NEPA, or really anything happening on those 4 forests is categorized as an acre treated within Fry. But the actual contract, the large contract acres within Fry, started getting hit in about 2014. And so again, that was supposed to be a 10-year, 300,000 acre contract, and they've only cut about 10% of it in a little over 7 years. FWPP, we started implementing just about right away because the city had a crew, they had city-owned acres, the city had recently purchased more open space as well, and they were able to get their hand crew out and start doing strategic fuel reductions immediately, and that was a big win to show some early progress. And then they started hitting more of the mechanical treatment acres as time went on. They were able to get some really innovative prep work in on the ground, get some matching grants from the state. And then the Forest Service treatments took almost, I think, about 4 years from the initial bond approval until the NEPA was completed. And I mean, they fast-tracked this really well. So I'm not complaining that it took 4 years. I mean, we had owl packs and, again, some of the most intense recreation acres across the whole region in that spot. So they really pushed through a great NEPA that went through quick. And we started implementing as soon as we could. So it was about 4 years from start of the bond until the Forest Service started implementing within the Watershed Protection Project, but the city was able to get in literally that next summer.
Okay.
So, and it's still going. I mean, I hate to say there's an end date, because once we get the trees out of there, it's, you know, get the fire in there. That's how we maintain that investment.
Sure. Okay, that's helpful. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a background of the 3 projects that we're going to be looking at today, as we ask a few questions of our panelists about, you know, some of maybe the not so pretty details of what these projects take. So I'd like to just start with the question to each of you, and if you could take, you know, 10 minutes or so to answer this, or what do you consider really the most significant lessons that you've learned thus far on working on your project? And let's go ahead and just go in that same order. Sarah, if you wouldn't mind taking a stab at that first.
Yeah, sure, thanks. It's a great question, and I'll say that for Lake Tahoe West, we actually have started writing a kind of a short paper on lessons learned, and we did a survey with some of our stakeholders and staff to get at some of those key lessons. So we have thought about this a little bit, and I'm going to share 3 lessons with you today. The first one is around, in Lake Tahoe West, we really used our early phases, the landscape resilience assessment and the landscape restoration strategy, to develop a common vision and understanding of the landscape and to build agreement about the restoration needs and approaches. And for Lake Tahoe West, I think that was really critical to kind of spend that time up front before we went into developing proposed actions. And every landscape is different. Maybe it's not the case for where you are, but in Tahoe, you know, the stakes, well, anywhere really, the stakes get higher when you start developing proposed actions. In Lake Tahoe West, that's when we started to get the attention from more national level environmental organizations. So it was beneficial that we had spent some of that time working through those, especially the issues that, you know, could have been considered more controversial, that we were able to work through some of those before we got into the proposed actions. So that's lesson 1, is just like, you know, how do you build that common vision and understanding of the landscape? And for us, it was that shared assessment and strategy. The second lesson, which I think is really important, somewhat unique from Lake Tahoe West because it was very science-centric, but the lesson is basically to target science where it's really needed the most and let any needs for new science kind of emerge from the collaborative process. And I'll say a little bit more about that. We did a ton of science in Lake Tahoe West, to the extent that for me, it became almost managing a science process instead of a stakeholder process. And it took away from our ability a little bit to keep stakeholders engaged. And Brett could probably speak to that a little bit in his experience with Lake Tahoe West. It just became very technical, and the science kind of dragged on in terms of the timeline. So we did great science in Lake Tahoe West. It was super informative. It helped us shape our strategy, and it's going to help us with our environmental document. But it also bogged us down to some degree. So, you know, I don't know what the thinking is right now for your group around engaging new science or, you know, thinking about research needs on the ground. But the lesson from Lake Tahoe West is to think carefully about what science you really need and target your resources there and your time there, because it is very time consuming to do science within the context of a collaborative process. And then the last lesson is around process, and there's a couple components. Maybe this is two lessons, but part A is make sure that your expectations are aligned and realistic in terms of what partners want to get out of the process. You might have to do some hard prioritization of your goals to make it realistic. And then part B is relatedly, don't make your process more complicated than it needs to be. You know, keep it simple. Keep it as simple as you can. And, you know, nothing about landscape management is complex. So obviously there's going to be, there's going to be some complexity, but don't wrap yourself up around the axle with more complex process than you need. So maybe just a couple of examples to share on that. One thing that our executives did early on was prioritize the ecological restoration side rather than the recreation side. And I think, you know, the way that Lake Tahoe West was originally framed was kind of encompassing all of that. And I think our Lake Tahoe West executives realized pretty early on, like, whoa, that scope's actually pretty unmanageable for us to take on recreation and think that we can do that within the context of this process. So they really directed us to keep it focused on ecological restoration, you know, with the acknowledgement that healthy forests, healthy streams, healthy watersheds are essential to providing quality recreation in Tahoe, but directed us away from getting into questions around trails or trails management, things like that. So I think that was a hard choice, but it helped us focus on what we could do in Lake Tahoe West and do well, and kind of put those recreation questions into more appropriate venues where they've been able to move forward in Tahoe. And then in terms of process, just keep in mind that collaboration and these big landscape projects is super time consuming. So agency staff and stakeholders devote a lot of their time, and they can get burned out. I think in Lake Tahoe West, if we did it over again, we would probably focus the really intensive collaboration pieces, really think about where we needed consensus and focus the collaborative process in those areas, rather than defining the process broadly as, hey, this is all collaborative, this is all consensus based, because it does slow things down, and you're using people's time. And yeah, I think there's probably ways to target that collaborative effort a little bit more strategically than we did in Lake Tahoe West. I think that's it. That's all I'll say for now, but happy to take questions on any of that.
Sure, and I think if it's okay with this group, if you would jot your questions down, and or, you know, you can feel free to put them in the chat. I'd like to get the take from the other panelists too and move through these, and then we'll sort of open it up after that, if that's okay. So Brett, how about you? I know you guys have drafted a lessons learned document. Can you summarize that for this group, given, and maybe build off of it?
I'm really not. You can read the document, but to be honest with you, it doesn't tell what the issues were. It was partners coming together, and no one wanted to offend each other at the beginning. So you saw a clean version, and you can read it. You know, I'll give you more on what really was helpful and what the lessons. The first one, and fortunately, we aren't in Lake Tahoe like Sarah has to deal, because she has to deal with a lot of groups and a lot of agencies. We wanted to move quickly. We're in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there's more bears than there are people in our area. And so what we tried to do, and we were successful at, was bring a group of agencies together that had a balanced approach, and they had knowledge about what to do in the forest. In some fashion, they had funding that they could either give themselves or bring along with them. And they had the ability, we used to hold monthly meetings. They had the ability, everyone at that table had to have the ability to agree at that table, not take it back to their management, not take it back to their board of supervisors. And we prepped them all. We said, look, you need to go get that ability before you come, because if you don't come with that, we're going to end up taking years. And that's not something each of the agencies were interested in. So if you can do that, that's very valuable, but we understand you can't always do that. The other real helpful lesson learned, and we did it as part of what Sarah was talking about, the science, only it wasn't about forestry, it was about fire. We had the Nature Conservancy, who helped in many ways, particularly during the NEPA. I mean, they have people on their staff who used to fight these projects with lawsuits. So they know all sides of it. And that was very helpful to us in working with conservation groups in convincing them we were doing the right thing. But they also had been working in this fire modeling area. And we had hired a forester who did an initial prescription, and we kind of gave him our goals and guidelines, what we were going to do. And we ran the model. And what we found out is, and there was some economics around it too, right? So what we found out was we were leaving far too much material on the forest, even after all the work we were going to do. And so we looked at that. We decided, okay, we're going to have to spend more money. We're going to have to remove biomass, more than we thought. And so the group decided we'll go raise another $1 million and we'll remove another chunk. When we reran the fire modeling, it suddenly brought it down to a level that we all were comfortable with that would protect the forest. So that was by far the most valuable piece of science. The rest of it, People know how to take care of owls. They know how to take care, like Sarah said, that stuff's, it's not really rocket science anymore, although I know the Forest Service thinks it is, but that's okay. A lot of research has been done in a lot of those areas, but fire modeling is relatively new. We were not only able to use it for our own benefit of trying to treat the forest in a better way, but it also came in handy when we went through the NEPA CEQA process, because we were able to show that the no action alternative was actually the worst action alternative for the forest. Because if you left all the material on, which we ran, it was going to ignite and it was going to burn through. In fact, it's on the path, the wind will blow. And if ours caught fire, all of Lake Tahoe West would have been burned down. That's because it's 30 miles away, right in the direct path. So that was a lesson that we're now using on future projects, that the fire modeling is essential. You know, it's not cheap, but it's also not too expensive given what value you're going to get out of it. So I would say, you know, those are probably the biggest lessons learned on the contracting side. I mean, I could spend hours on doing it better, but we have a pretty efficient system. And each area is different. Each set of contractors, each sale administrator from the Forest Service is different. They all have different, but you know, you'll figure that out as you go along working with the Forest Service. So I'll stop there.
Great. And just for this group's knowledge, Brett's group did publish a lessons learned document. We've put that up on the web page for this project, as well as a number of documents that Neil has shared about the Flagstaff project, and we've stolen some of the Tahoe West material from the web as well. So it's kind of a one-stop shop that supports a lot of the material that we're talking about today from these panelists.
I sent you our first year operations report too, didn't I?
Yep, that's up there too.
Okay, good.
So I just wanted to call the attention of this group. If a certain particular point piques your interest, a lot of that information is up on that web page. Neil, you've been at it longest. My guess is you've had some lessons as well.
We the largest log industry dissolved in northern Arizona, in just like a lot of other places, kind of in the early 90s, and it wasn't really because of owls and lawsuits. It's because our trees grow really slow out here, and they basically cut most of them. And so, you know, the industry left because it was in their economic interest. It wasn't some sort of legal thing. I mean, yeah, a tiny percentage of land was being impacted by lawsuits, but I mean, it really was just the traditional, the big trees aren't growing fast enough, we're going to go somewhere else. So there's been collaboration to do something to prevent catastrophic fires in northern Arizona, basically a year or two after those mills left in the early 90s. They started realizing that we've got catastrophic fires starting at a couple thousand acres in the early 90s. In 1996, there was a 15,000 acre fire in the Coconino, and that was the largest wildfire in the history of the forest. Now we have 15,000 acre fires that they manage for forest plan benefits, and nobody thinks twice about it. So there's been collaboration taking place here for a long time, and a lot of those folks are still around, and it's wonderful talking about what they went through early on. But one thing that I think is consistent through all of this is it's incredibly messy, and it's you know, that's just I think it's messy when you get 30 people in the room together and everybody wants something different. It's going to get weird. And so a couple of things that I keep telling myself is, you know, tell the truth, which sometimes is people really have a hard time just saying anything. It's like, just tell the truth. It's not, you can't get, nobody's going to blame you if you say the wrong thing, if it's something you think is the truth. Be open to trusting others. So this gets into, you know, my TNC days. They were always the mantra of assume good intent. So if you assume that somebody's communicating with good intentions and you trust them on that, you know, you're going to be able to build some relationships on that. And I think in the collaborative world, it's until people get that comfort with each other, a lot of people just sit there quiet, and you know they have something useful to say, whether it's that they have something that they're excited about or something that they're really pissed off about. You know, it's like, well, say it. I hate when there's silence, and it's like, I know this person over there has something important, and they're just holding it so tight. It's just get it out there. And over time, I think as we've built trust across our stakeholder groups, people can feel more comfortable saying what they want to say, and it just accelerates the process. When we leave a meeting and it's like, well, I know that group over there didn't say anything, and that's not a good thing because they're going to go say it to somebody else, and they need to say that in front of everybody so we're on the same page, because I don't want to hear about it in the newspaper. I want to hear about it in the meeting. I think really creating that environment where people can be open is important. The entire room plays a responsibility to do that. It can't just be one person. Another lesson learned on our end, large scale NEPA needs flexibility. And NEPA nowadays, isn't really something people like to be flexible with. So in the first EIS, even though it was 1 million acres, there was an expectation that every single acre would have an identified prescription of some sort based on remote sensing analysis. And what we're finding is when we actually get to some of these projects and we put boots on the ground, the prescription that was identified, it sounds silly, how much more can we complicate a ponderosa pine forest, that has one tree for millions of acres. But the prescriptions, the prescriptions really were pretty simple, but we'd get to one spot and say, well, this doesn't work. And it's like, well, that's because our data kind of sucks and our, extrapolating across the landscape and old stand exams and all this stuff. And so what we're trying to build into the next EIS is more of a flexible toolbox approach. But then again, that requires trust where, if the Forest Service goes out and cowboys up and does something weird, and not just within our footprint, but anywhere, it starts breaking down that trust. And then the usual groups come and say, well, we can't trust you to do the right thing. So we need to know up front, what are you going to do on every acre? So that's where that building the trust helps actually result in better treatments, because then our NEPA is flexible and it's based on actually getting to a site and looking at it versus a GIS exercise. Another lesson learned that I think we're constantly struggling with is identify who will benefit. And that's where the city of Flagstaff decided to tax itself, because we will benefit from a healthy forest. I think we struggle at times to broaden that scope and look for who's going to provide capacity to make this stuff happen. Well, the city of Phoenix, 5+ million people, a whole lot of that water ends up coming from northern Arizona's forests. And we're constantly trying to figure out ways to tap into that reality of spreading some costs amongst the people in the valley that, if you live in Phoenix and you like clean water, or you like the golf, or you like a yard that's not rocks, you probably like healthy forests in northern Arizona. So identifying those people that benefit is an important process. Another lesson is there's nothing wrong with direct capacity support. I think there's some stakeholders that will sometimes say things like, oh, well, we need to transform a process, or, that's their job. I can't do that. That's their job. And it's, the reality with the Forest Service, they just don't have the staff to do some of these things. So the community comes at them and says, we need you to go do a 2.4 million acre project. Oh, and then by the way, we need you to do this Watershed project right up the road here. And so going to the Forest Service and saying, what do you need? And if they say, we just need capacity, I have no problem saying, well, how can I help fill that? How can I help fund that? Not everything necessarily needs to be transforming a process. In emergency management, it's fix the emergency. I'm not going to, if we've got a patient in an ambulance having a heart attack, now is not the time to talk about what is your diet, and how can we fix that? It's get them to not have a heart attack at the moment. So that direct capacity support, I think sometimes stakeholders have a hard time saying, well, Forest Service should be doing this. They should be doing it, but they can't. It's not that they don't want to, they literally can't. So let's help them do it. Demonstrating progress early to build momentum. Greater Flagstaff Forest Partnership has been doing treatments around Flagstaff for 20+ years. We've got, a 100,000 acre buffer around the community. We're already having to go back in and treat these acres again. So progress builds to a culture of expectation that we do things. Don't let perfection get in the way. It's, I can't tell you how many times we've been in the woods and we argue about, well, why did you cut that tree? And it's like, that logger cuts a couple thousand trees a day. I don't know why they cut that one tree. As long as it's not an old growth, I'll gladly argue about why did you cut that 300-year-old tree, but I don't want to argue about why they cut that 12-inch tree. So as long as they're creating a structure and pattern that is acceptable, let's not get in the way of perfection being in the way of progress. And I think one lesson learned with a lot of our stakeholders here and our legislature and donors and everything around is timber projects are shiny and flashy, and people love to go out and see a feller buncher cutting trees and skidders making log decks and watching log trucks leave the woods, and everybody gets super excited about that. We're empowering rural communities with jobs, but that to some degree is the easy part. We can throw money at projects and loggers will show up and do it. What we don't have is a workforce that is in a position to implement the fire that we need. We have a national workforce based on suppression that does prescribed burning in their spare time. And if all of these different collaborative projects are successful, we are not going to have the ability to maintain these investments with our current workforce. So really a big lesson learned on my end that I'm trying to get more traction with over time is helping people realize that log truck driving out of the woods isn't the end of the project. We have to get back in there and start thinking about fire right away. So fire adapted communities, we have to think about smoke impacts. How are we providing resources to communities about smoke? And how are we just getting, a state legislature that loves to talk about logging and hates to talk about prescribed burning? How do we change that? So it's that's a big lesson learned for us over time. We've had wonderful success in Flagstaff getting people to support prescribed fire. We had a really cool survey come out last summer, and we had huge community support for prescribed burning and about half of that support for smoke. So it's this messaging that people like good fire, but they don't want the smoke. So how can we provide tools to deal with that? So a big lesson learned is don't shy away from talking about smoke impacts that are going to come from maintaining these investments.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, that smoke's a big one for us too. And last summer was one of the more punishing summers I think any of us can remember being part of. So that's going to be something that we're going to have to work hard on here as well. So taking those lessons learned, which, run the gamut depending on where you guys are. And I know you could talk for hours and hours about this. And luckily I have your email addresses. So if there's other questions that come up through this process, I know how to find you. I'm curious if with each of your experiences, and Sarah, this might be maybe not really a tougher one for you because you have sort of fewer years to draw on, but I'm really curious if there was a sort of a tipping point or a fulcrum point for your project where you really saw a change in sort of the momentum of the group. And if so, can you talk a little bit about what drove that? Just out of curiosity, I think it may be different amongst the groups, but was there something that comes to mind specifically that you noted real change?
Yeah, I could let Brett and Neil go. I mean, I think it's like you said, Lake Tahoe West hasn't been around as long. I will say that I think the Angora fire in 2007 was a tipping point for the wider Tahoe community, just a recognition that, wow, we need to do something different. And so that spurred some real organizational movement towards coordinating federal, state, and local strategies around wildfire protection and fuels reduction. And then that led directly to Lake Tahoe West. So that doesn't exactly answer your question, but I think, I think our tipping point actually came several years before Lake Tahoe West actually formed, but it was a real catalyst for change in the basin.
Yeah, I think that's the exact kind of example that we're looking for, because we had the creek fire last summer, which almost made it to town, but it breathed down our neck and we were directly downwind for the better part of 3 months. So similar. Brett, how about you?
Sure, and Sarah's right. I participated in that aftermath of the Angora fire because I did some work in Tahoe, and she's right. It raised everybody's awareness enough to start talking to each other and working things out. For us, when we started the partnership, we all had good intentions, but other than, the water agency and the county knew the Forest Service, but the Nature Conservancy was someone new. And we spent the first several months while we were working through the goals and objectives, sort of not putting ourselves in the other people's shoes. So for example, I was from the evil county, the evil government, right? And the Forest Service was the evil federal government. Well, the Nature Conservancy was the evil ecological people who sued us, right? And so it took us a while. We had to become comfortable with each other. We had to talk through issues. And while we were talking about goals, it became very apparent that while we were saying the same thing, everybody thought we were meaning something else for a while, until we broke it down to, you got to get down to the how many trees per acre. What are you talking about taking off? Or I mean, for example, the Nature Conservancy thought we wanted to remove every large tree so we could make more money on the timber side. That was, we had no desire to do that. We already knew we weren't going to, you know, my goal was to lose less. That was going in because I knew we couldn't cover it with costs anyways, but let's do the right thing. We wanted to protect the assets. We're also responsible actually for recreation. We're actually more responsible than the Forest Service for recreation on this project because we hold a Federal Energy Commission license for the area, and of which recreation is part of it. So we have to do everything. And so it became the ability to trust each other about what when we're, it's kind of like Neil said, the TNC motto is assume the best. Well, they didn't, because they thought we were someone else. And then once they knew us and vice versa, we began to trust each other. And so that really set the stage for allowing us to agree much quicker on the goals and the treatments, which in turn then got us looking at, okay, what does your agency do? What are you good at? What kind of experience do you really have? And then we were able to sort of divide up and conquer things faster. So we hired, for example, the water agency had the most experience hiring NEPA people because we had just gone through a FERC relicensing process. So they stepped up and did that. The Nature Conservancy had the most background in how to craft the language so to stay out of lawsuits. The county, we had the most experience in hiring contractors and working forest operations. And so we divided that up and concentrated. I mean, we still were participatory in all the decisions, each of us, but the Nature Conservancy trusted the county to move forward with the Master Stewardship Agreement. The Forest Service did. We trusted the Nature Conservancy to do all the final editing on the NEPA for us, and so did the Forest Service. So it was really trust is huge, particularly, you know, it's not even particular. We had a small group, trust is huge, but a large group, trust is even more valuable probably. We all knew we wanted to work quickly. So for us, that was really the change that got us started. And actually it turned us more aggressive into, we could see the light at the end of the tunnel. So we all began to spend more time looking for funds. We even went back to Washington, DC on joint trips, which for those agencies to all go to the same trip is tough. Now, what we did is when we went to a Republican's office, the county and the water agency would take the lead and TNC would sort of keep quiet. When we went to a Democrat's office, the roles would be reversed, right? So, but we were all supportive of all those goals. And so that's really was the big turning point for us. And since then, we've still relied on, you know, now the Nature Conservancy has done more work in the prescribed fires. So they work with the Forest Service on that. We've done more work on the on-the-ground operations. So we work with the Forest Service on that. So that's kind of, it's helped us divide and conquer and get things moving quicker.
Super. And then last for you, Neil, how about in Flagstaff?
Yeah. By the way, before Neil starts, Neil, I'm working with Ed Smith and he likes you. So that's been helpful. Ed's with TNC and he remembers you.
Yep. I think he was on my hiring team in 2006 when I came to Flagstaff.
Yeah, he just gave you 5 stars.
Great. Thanks. I wanted to share my screen real quick. Our management action point for the Watershed Protection Project was this. This was can you guys see that okay?
Yep.
This was the Schultz fire. So in 2010, this red boundary on the upper right picture there, that blew up right on Father's Day, 2010. And it started from an illegal campfire. There's a lot of recreation in that area. That's a combination of just general recreation and the occasional homeless person sitting in the woods for the summer. So they never were able to identify who started it. But the reality was it was also in an area where there was some treatments planned for that. There was a NEPA, it went through litigation. I don't really remember the details of it, but it just didn't happen. I mean, our timber market here, it takes years to get people lined up to do things because the pace is just so slow. So, you know, you might finalize a NEPA when they were doing 10,000 acre NEPAs and get that thing finalized, prep some acres, put out a timber sale, sell it, wait 2 years for them to get in there. So it can take a long time, but either way, it didn't get treated. and literally lawsuits were just being dealt with, and then this fire blows up. And so it was relatively small, of 15,000 acres, but that upper right picture, you can see those steep slopes that burned. So those steep slopes burned at very high severity. And instead of having that big basin down below that would catch any of the runoff and the usual flooding impacts post high severity fire, that whole stand was pretty much slicked off. I think it was something, there was almost 10,000 of the 15,000 acres were high to moderate severity. So very hot fire. And then right below that red polygon is a community. And so all those houses right there were suddenly in these floodplains that were not supposed to be in a floodplain. There was literally, I think 2 weeks after the fire, like 100-year storm event on top of that fire scar. So big flooding impacts. A young girl died. She was playing in a wash and she drowned. So loss of life. That whole highway was shut down for a while, and that's the main route from Flagstaff up to Page. There's about only 2 ways to get north of Flagstaff, and that was one of them. So people were driving on dirt roads on the Navajo Nation land instead of the highway. So it was a big impact. There's a great document. I think Janet sent that around. It's called the Schultz Fire Full Cost Accounting by Northern Arizona University. Over $140 million has been spent. And that was, I think, it's about 5 years old now. And we had flooding impacts last year from this. It's still real. It still is happening. It impacted the city's water supply. So that was 2010. And so when the voters were asked to do something about it, it was still fresh in their mind. So that was really our management action point for the Watershed Protection Project bond. But if we think about Forefry, this gets more into our landscape scale issue. And so this is the Verde and the Salt River watersheds. These provide a large amount of water into the reservoirs that feed down into Phoenix. So Phoenix gets Colorado River water, it has a lot of wells, and then it has these surface flows that fill up some reservoirs. Lots of hydroelectric power comes out of these waterways. And it's not all forest, it's a lot of grassland. But the majority of the moisture comes from the forested acres within these 2 watersheds. So we have a nice chart put together by the Salt River Project here that talks about how over time we've seen changes in the acres burned. So 84,000 or 85,000 acres in the 80s, 227,000 acres in the 90s, but then that's the big show, our 2000s. We've got the Wallow, the Rodeo, and then a lot more fires down in the desert areas as well. And then we throw in since 2002. So we really were having these landscape scale impacts of catastrophic fire. Now, again, not every acre that's red burned in a severe way. There was great diversity of fire severity, but in general, these were all uncontrolled wildfires. And so that's really what was our management action point for Forefry in around 2010. We had the 2002 Rodeo Chetasky fire. We had, going back many years, the Dude fire north of Payson, that was a fatality fire. And then Forefry started building around 2010 with the CFLRP process. Wallow fire happens in 2011, 538,000 acres. And then in 2013, Yarnell happens. And so this is really, I think, where our first responders need to play a greater role in speaking up about what's happening out there, because to some degree, we know how to make sure that firefighters don't have to run into catastrophic situations when there's smoke in the air. Not every landscape is easy to get there, but we know, especially with our ponderosa pine and our mixed conifer forests, what it takes to restore a fire adapted structure and pattern. It's just how much money are our communities and our partners willing to invest to make that happen up front versus responding to not only catastrophic fires, but community events like what happened in Yarnell. So we really have a duty as first responders to speak up and involve ourselves and help people remind each other when they're in there arguing about, well, should this be 58 basal area? Should this be 60 basal area? What size groups should we have in our group structure? What distance interspace? That stuff doesn't really matter when you're running in there with tools and water lines. What matters is it putting my life at risk being there or not? So sometimes it's worth remembering that sometimes the ecological flexibility is there to keep things safe. And like I said earlier, we can always get into kind of the fine tuning of our prescriptions when we have the flexibility, but in the meantime, keep it from burning down.
Yeah, and I like to think of it as it's really a privilege to be able to have these arguments, because we have had loss recently in a community in Mono County last fall, and I think some of the folks on this call could speak to sort of how much work that's been to sort of try to recover from, and that's a long process as well. So I have one last question, then we'll open it up just to around the floor, but I'm really curious how each of your specific efforts measure success or plan to.
Sure, I can go first again. That seems to be the order we're taking. And I think my answer is pretty simple. For us, we're developing our monitoring plan right now, and what we're really basing that on is our landscape restoration strategy. And are we achieving the goals that we laid out in that strategy? I think, the other element that comes with that, to me, that's not in our strategy, is just the relationships. Are we building and maintaining strong relationships with partners and stakeholders? Because I think, we have found throughout the process that that's really critical to keeping the process moving, keeping momentum going. So I think people come and go, and so it's more even just than building interpersonal relationships. It's like, well, no, it is. It's over the course of a years-long, maybe decades-long process, are you able to keep those relationships strong and continue to build on them? And I also think collaboration can actually fray relationships. So to me, I think making sure that we maintain good working relationships in the Tahoe Basin it's critical. It's not defined in our landscape restoration strategy exactly like that, but that's a piece that I think I'm also really looking at. Yeah, so that's all I'll say.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Oftentimes it's what's being read between the lines in any given written document is somewhat as valuable, if not more so, than what's actually transcribed. Brian, how about you guys?
Yeah, I would agree with Sarah. It's about the relationships, and you need to hold successful activities. For example, we have chosen to celebrate each significant passing of some event. Like, when we completed NEPA, we had a fun, outing that we all went to, and we had dinner and relaxed and didn't talk about the forest. We talked about our personal lives. After the first contractors were out there working, we had an on-site visit for everybody to see. And so in each year, we actually hold a retreat where we stay overnight and become personal, so to speak. We do a tour, we look at lessons learned. I give them a rundown of everything that's gone on. And then, we actually ask them to turn around. If they've seen anything they like, I give them a month so we can change operations for the next year. And it's become, the one guy from TNC who he and I used to argue like cats and dogs at the beginning, he and his wife are coming out to see us in Wyoming this year. We've become personal friends. And I think that right there keeps you working towards your goals. It's just like anything else in life. And I will say that the measure of success, of course, to me as a program manager, is when it's safe, right? When the logs are out and the brush is treated and the prescribed fire is done. But we're also building in, as I said before, we have responsibilities around our hydroelectric power. And so we're building in, we've already thought through the phases of, we're going to do this first part on the ground. Then once it's treated a little bit, we're going to start the prescribed fire. And once that gets going, it'll be time for us to go back in and do much smaller and much cheaper treatments. And, we have a license for 40 years. So we're in this. I'm retiring, but, and I'll be helping them along the way afterwards. But I think that's the commitment. If you're going to spend these millions of dollars, no matter whose money you get it from, it's still your community. It's your area. You owe it to yourself to keep it, like Neil's picture of the before, 100 years ago versus now. You owe it to keep it to whatever you can get it to today. It's really worthwhile.
Yeah, and believe me, once COVID's over, I'm ready for some sort of celebration in person for sure. And then lastly, Neil, how about you guys? What's success look like in Flagstaff?
Well, you know what? I have a love-hate relationship with acres treated because I constantly want more acres treated, but then that's not the whole story so much of the time. So I love looking at the list and seeing more acres treated, but I also want to see, okay, what else? And so another example that was a huge success story for us last year, just before COVID hit, we got some traction on this. We were able to finance about $6 of the $10 million through the bond, through something called the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which is managed through the Arizona Water Infrastructure Finance Authority. There's a bunch of acronyms in there. I think I got something close to it. But basically through that revolving fund that traditionally does more kind of concrete sort of projects around water quality, treatment plants. This was kind of a non-point source thing that was new to them, but going in and realizing that preventing these impacts protects our water supplies. That favorable rate and principal forgiveness is going to save the city of Flagstaff about $1.4 million. So that was a huge victory for us that we found a way. I know it's weird, but we found a way to work with financial institutions to reduce the cost of our work, which at the end of the day, again, gets into, I have economic problems, not so much ecologic problems. And so that was a huge success story that was important for people to learn about, that behind the scenes, there's so much work that goes into preparing and implementing this work. Our director of finance, all these agencies, it really, at no point in that project did we actually go look at a pine tree in the woods. It was all the other work. And so that's an important success story for us. And then also one of my favorite staff out here on the Coconino, a sale administrator, Jacob Lopez. One day we had a meeting where we were talking about what does success look like. And he goes, just one day I want to drive by in my Forest Service truck that says timber on it. And I want people to cheer and smile and wave like they do when the fire engine goes by. And we all said, good luck with that, Jacob. But I think that's success where, people of all sorts are valuing the inputs that are going into these projects across our community. So it's not just, the hero isn't just a person who's responding to the wildfire, but how can we make the people who start the fires and prescribe burns heroes? How can we make the people who give the loggers the feedback they need to have in order to maintain their contract success? I mean, it really takes all these things to fall into place, and helping people in the community recognize that how diverse and how hard these projects are is another part of how we measure success. So just, our community outreach, we try the best we can to track that and report it back up through the food chain. And sometimes it's as simple as having a wildly successful social media post to, documenting all our outreach opportunities.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate you answering sort of my scripted questions, but I'd like to open it up now for the group. And if you guys wouldn't mind, if you have a question for any of our panelists, to raise your hand, and we'll try to be in some sort of orderly fashion. I think there's a lot of knowledge here that we can utilize for certain, and I'm hoping that this discussion has spurred some interest and intrigue by our group. So anybody out there? Nathan, go for it.
I just want to start by saying thanks. I appreciate you being willing to come and talk with us. It's been really valuable. I guess I just wanted to kind of maybe touch on two things, and hopefully you guys could speak to your experience on your projects with respect to these two items. But I feel like in this project, we have two main or significant challenges. One is dealing with biomass. We're similar, I think, to the Flagstaff project where we don't have a mill nearby. So what do we do with that material? So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about how you have dealt with that, in particular where you don't have a mill where you can take that material to. And then the second one, I think, is just changing the public perception about not only this work and how this work might change what our forests look like and feel like to the public, in particular the recreating public, but also helping them understand the value of the work and in the future, the value of putting fire back on the landscape in a very significant way, something that we haven't been doing for decades. So I'm just really curious about, you know, any lessons learned you have around that public outreach and education piece, in particular around changing forest structure to make it look more like it used to, and then again, coming in after the fact to put fire on the landscape. So thank you.
I'm happy to dive in on the biomass question. Right now, our strategy is leave it in the woods and burn it. Unless we can afford to subsidize hauling it, we can barely afford to subsidize the logs. So we look at potentially $500 to $1,000 an acre at times to get in front of the loggers to-do list just for the mechanical logging. And then if we want to move the biomass, that could be another $1,000 an acre. We across 4 fry, I mean, we're looking at, I mean, an equal amount of biomass in tons per acre to the saw logs coming out of the woods. And what the definition of biomass is evolves a little bit based on, are we talking about whole tree processing? Are we leaving the tops? The big hope for everybody out here is that we could find a way to get an electrical generation station that's basically shutting down, that currently runs on coal, to become something that can utilize biomass. We have a 27 megawatt facility in Snowflake, Arizona, but I mean, even they are struggling to get renewals of their 10-year contracts that are expiring in 2 years. So we have this weird reality where we have this giant supply, but we don't have the markets to utilize it right now. So just creating the contracts and guaranteeing supply is not enough. There has to be other components to it that align. And so this is where it gets political. So we have the Arizona Corporation Commission that for a couple of years, we had 2 of 5 votes in favor of mandating biomass utilization for the electrical companies, where we need 3 out of 5 votes. So that would be really nice if we could just get 1 more vote, and then they create a mandate for the utilities to buy this electricity, and then we retrofit these coal plants. Literally, we could retrofit 1 more coal plant to burn 60 megawatts, and that would vacuum up about 90 megawatts will vacuum up 50,000 acres a year of biomass for us. And then that really opens the door up to all kinds of other options for utilizations for our sawmills. I mean, we're still going to lose money on pulp logs, but we're building a pretty innovative firewood project out of some of that. So if we can just keep the saw logs going to the sawmill, the biomass going to the biomass facilities, and potentially come up with a firewood project that supplies free firewood to, you know, half of the state of Arizona. That's kind of our vision. But the biomass, then we're actually going through a project right now, or a process right now, where the legislature is looking to strip the authority of the Corporation Commission to mandate the utilization of biomass. So I don't really know where that's coming from, but it's just like, oh, how much more complicated? Because now, if it goes away from the Corporation Commission, where we only need 3 of 5 votes, then I need to convince the whole legislature, and that's a whole lot more expensive and difficult. And so the you know, alternative methods of utilization, whether it's some of these emerging products of, you know, biochar, torrefaction. I mean, we had this really cool effort out of NAU, Northern Arizona University, where they worked with a railroad company and took basically clean chips. So they had it didn't include the bark or the needles as much as they could, and they chipped it and put it on 50 rail cars and sent it to South Korea, and came up with a per ton estimate of that. And it was about my estimate, the railroads wouldn't give their clear numbers, but my estimate is somewhere around $120 to $140 a ton is what it costs to get it to South Korea. And they're willing to potentially pay $70 to $80 a ton. So the interesting number is, if we have to subsidize $40 a ton here versus $30 a ton to send it to South Korea, you know, we've got these really weird numbers taking place. But then, yeah, I mean, it's really the biggest bottleneck, where as long as we can't get the biomass out of the woods, I think everything else is going to stall. The large contract the Forest Service awarded, really, it required the removal of all the biomass except for the natural amount that's allowed on the landscape when they're done for landing rehab, road rehab, and just like the 4 to 8 tons per acre they're allowed to leave. And they literally get shut down because they can't keep logging because they have too much biomass left in the woods. So we know we could keep those logs moving, but we can't because their contract mandates the removal of the biomass, which takes a lot longer. So it's definitely a problem here. We have no solutions. We've tested some things. We know we can burn it for electricity at a scale that will make a difference, but it's just not happening yet. And then as far as changing the public perception, you know, Flagstaff has a really cool culture of getting people involved in these projects. We have recreation groups, the mountain bike groups, the trail building groups, and I think they're finally getting the reality that you know, if their forest burns down, then their trail really isn't so cool anymore. And unfortunately, we've had that happen in some pretty popular recreation areas. So they're really getting on board and supporting and collaborating with these groups where in the past, you know, the biking group just really wasn't involved in anything other than trail building. But now we're getting them more involved in these collaborative processes. And it took us reaching out to them. They really weren't coming to the table on their own. And then also getting out in the community. So a couple times we've received some grants and held these events where we would have fire trucks and logging equipment, and it was basically the university logging team was out there, and we would just have it like a community building in a giant parking lot, all these people, and it was kind of like a come meet a firefighter, come meet a logger, and let your kid climb into the Feller Buncher. So the local John Deere dealer would bring some equipment over, and I think putting faces and names changes things. Some of the conservation groups that really early on were very questioning the logging efforts. It's like, well, listen, this is the person who drives the machine. And I guarantee you, we spend a lot of time talking about what is a transitioning old growth and whether they should cut it or not, because they're not cutting the old growth, and he knows that. So let's talk about how these people are real people, and it's not just some monster in a machine trying to high grade the forest anymore. And so really getting the community involved in these projects. I wish we could do it every summer. And I've even proposed on Earth Day, we should have like the loggers come to City Park, and they're like, I don't know if we're ready for that yet, but but I think getting people to realize that, you know, these are the people protecting our forests, and it's a big team effort. So helping them and then they see the, you know, $500,000 delimber that's parked out there, and they start realizing how expensive this work is. I mean, if that logging site isn't making multiple thousands of dollars a day, they're losing money. So I think that's been a successful effort for us, is getting these folks out into the community and letting people meet them and having names and faces, and the loggers that are still here to some degree, most of them have been here for over 30 years, and they figured out a way to transition from when they were high grading to now, you know, barely staying in business. So getting them out in the community is important.
I'll tackle that. You know, we're fortunate we have a mill and we have a couple of biomass facilities. I say fortunate, but you know, as I pointed out, the mill asked us to stop bringing because there's so few mills that they had to take in the capacity, which is the right thing to do. On the biomass side, you know, it's boom or bust, and mostly it's bust in California. You know, there's a lot of discussion going on with the state and the legislature, and there's something that passed that requires, in your case, Southern Cal Edison to purchase the power from you. And actually, Southern Cal Edison is better than who we have up here, which is Pacific Gas and Electric, who fight it at every way. But that's one possibility for you, is to figure out how to build a biomass facility, because you can get a reasonable price out of Southern Cal Edison as long as it's 3 megawatts or less through the biomat program. In our case, you know, we at the county, we're at the position now where we have a former landfill where we take wood in as part of our responsibility, and we just have no more markets to send it to. The biomass facilities are either shutting down or they're so poorly organized that it's not worth our time. And so we're seriously looking. We tried to build one once before and it wasn't there yet. Now we think, like, because the biomass is essentially free, we don't have to pay anybody, we already have it, that the economics are such that we're planning on potentially building our own small 2 megawatt facility. But it's a problem that isn't really going to get solved until, you know, like wind and solar, everybody raves about how good they are. Well, the reason that's there is because they have huge federal and state subsidies that bring the price down to about 3 cents a kilowatt. Biomass, I was able to get it down to 9 cents a kilowatt, but most of it's at 20 cents a kilowatt. Nobody's going to buy that, and therein lies the problem. So biomass is a tough problem. We do subsidize and haul it out. There are where it's easily accessible, where it's tougher. We do pile it in small piles and burn it as a part of the traditional burn plan of the Forest Service. So we do a mix of it. And I don't know what the solution is. I know I'm working with the water agency. They're about to build a water treatment facility, and they're looking at the cost to buy power to run that facility from Pacific Gas and Electric is astronomical per kilowatt. And so they've figured out, and I'm working with them, we're going to build them a small biomass facility that will allow them to essentially cut their costs in half or more. Rather than paying the 35 cents a kilowatt, they can make it for 15 cents a kilowatt. So the bottom line is that board of directors is going to save their ratepayers money by building it. And then we're going to utilize all of the biomass off the many projects that we're doing and just truck it right to the facility. So, I mean, where there's a problem and you can figure out a solution, if you've got the economics to do it, you can do it. So I noticed, LAWP is that's good. They've got money, they've got needs. Maybe they want to build a small biomass plant and you can truck it all to them and they can use the electricity for their water treatment plant. So that's one possibility. The other side that you asked about of getting the word out, I mean, we do a pretty good job. We hold tours for the legislature, both federal and state, CAL FIRE, all sorts of people. That helps. For the general public, we've got instructional signs that we're putting up around the project area. So when people come camp, they'll understand why we're doing what we're doing and why it's important. It will help their recreation. We try to get it in the newspaper as much as possible. We often will go speak at the fire safe councils in the area or the towns to let them know what the project's doing, why we're doing it, and why it will help protect them. So the word gets out slowly. I think it's, your community best. You'll be able to figure out how best to get that success out there.
I'll just add a little bit to the recreation piece. I think the biomass stuff, Brett and Neil spoke well to, and I don't have anything to add there. In terms of engaging recreation stakeholders and the public and just kind of building understanding and support for those actions, we've engaged recreation stakeholders throughout our collaborative process. And, part of the rationale there is that we'll be relying on them to some degree to communicate back with their constituents and help reach that community. So, we'll be providing informational materials, fact sheets, especially as we get closer to implementing the project that they can then take back and, send out in their newsletters and alerts and social media so that we're reaching a broader audience. We do have a small Lake Tahoe West communications team. It's me and communication staff from our 3 lead agency partners, the Forest Service, the California Tahoe Conservancy, and the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. So that's a huge help. We got a little funding early on from the Forest Service Regional Office to do some communications work. So if you can build in some funding support, I mean, it hasn't been a ton, but it's enough to do a video, and that's been really helpful to just have some staff time to work on those communications efforts. And like I said, we'll ramp up when we get closer to implementation. Right now, we're kind of just, using some of the same strategies that Brett talked about, like, speaking at homeowners groups, getting some articles in the paper, getting stuff out on social media. I do think that in Tahoe, the agencies have done a pretty good job in general with respect to both smoke. They're pretty coordinated in the basin. We have a website that, is current, up to date in terms of prescribed fires that are happening in the basin. You can go to that website and see what's happening today and what agencies are burning and why and where. So I think that's a great tool that if the public sees a fire, they can go to that website and understand why it's happening and that it's a prescribed fire. So I think we're fortunate in Lake Tahoe West to kind of be able to build on that coordination that's already there. I think also, there's just a larger awareness in California generally that we're hoping will stay high, right? Like Tahoe was so socked in by smoke for weeks and months in 2020, and I think you all were there as well in Mammoth. So I think people get it more and more, and it's like there's a window that we have now where we can move some of this work forward. And yeah, I think the momentum's kind of changing around that as well. And I love the idea, Neil, of community events and having the kids climb around on the fellow bunchers. I wrote that down, and I'm totally going to see if we can do that in Lake Tahoe West.
Yeah, when in doubt, get the big machines out, right? Other folks with questions for this group? I know that was a lot to sort of swallow in one sitting, but I'm hoping that some of these ideas and thoughts will help us as we really dig into the details.
I provided a link to the forfry.org website. So that's the stakeholder group website. The Forest Service has their own website. And in there, we have a link that says documents. And there's some documents very early on that a lot of effort went into, that we look back on those sometimes and we forget they're there, but those were some of the things that helped build the trust amongst the stakeholders in the Forest Service. And being a CFLRP project at the time, I mean, the stakeholders are in the driving seat on a lot of these things, and we need each other. The Forest Service can't do CFLRP type things on their own. And then if they cowboy up and do weird things, sometimes it ends up not happening anyways. And at the same time, the stakeholders, through those collaborative efforts, all had to basically come to some agreements. One of the documents in there that was kind of transformational at the time was something called the Large and Old Tree Protection Strategy. And so that outlined from the stakeholders to the Forest Service what our expectations were across the landscape. Basically, it's a framework for how to avoid litigation, in my opinion. And it said, you can, to some degree, you can proceed with not doing what is outlined in here, but it's just going to cost you time and money in the end. And potentially, when we talk about fire risk reduction, time and money can mean lives and livelihoods. So it's some of those documents are great to dive into and kind of get those expectations on paper and see how we did it, and see if they'd be useful for some of the projects that are a little earlier in the collaborative process.
So I have another question if I don't see any hands raised. Well, I see maybe John Wentworth turning his video on. John, you have a question there?
This has been very, very useful and very helpful. Mammoth Lakes is a community. We're about, let's say 20% human beings, 50% bears, and then 30% visitors, but it's actually kind of a different mix. But we're all here and all on top of each other. And I'm just wondering if any of the panelists, given the sequencing that we're in right now, we're working on defining a border, dealing with jurisdictional things, hopefully moving on to getting some environmental work done. Where do you think, what are the most important points in time to really be doing outreach, to make a really concerted effort to engage the community? Is it after you've got your project description, but before you've done the NEPA? Is it after you've done the NEPA? I'm interested in some thoughts on that, just to figure out what's going to be the best timing to really start engaging the community.
I don't think the bears care very much, but I think it's, your community best, whether you should start early with them or not. And I guess that's the only advice I could give you is, I didn't have to worry about much of the community. Sarah has to worry about everything, even the bears up there. They're but
our bears vote. I don't know about you.
Yeah, see, okay, we don't. Yeah, ours don't. So Sarah's
okay.
Yeah.
My answer, is a little silly, but it's yesterday, where I feel like we had some communication vacuums over the years within Forfry, and next thing we know, there's a High Country News article that was very painful, and so having the ability not just for a key group that might be like a communications group or something, but having the ability for stakeholders to have sort of an agreed upon communications route is great. So within the Forfry group, we have, it used to be quarterly. I think now it's more like twice a year, a newsletter that goes out that's, drafted by a stakeholder, and then every stakeholder gets to review and contribute to it. And so that's something that if there's, and it's not all nice news, some of it's talking about some of the issues we're having. And, And so creating those pathways so people don't have to kind of go out and do, you know, something. It's very often when a stakeholder cowboys up and does something on their own, that hasn't been discussed with a bunch of folks and making it agreeable, it ends up becoming a point of issue versus, you know, or a liability versus an asset. But you know, I think just really as much outreach as possible. That when there's a vacuum of information, people start making assumptions, and sometimes they're right, but very often it's, you know, people are scared. We are making drastic changes in a forest that they've seen for a long time. I mean, the guy who owns the biomass plant a couple years ago at a stakeholder meeting finally just admitted, he's like, listen, I had no idea how screwed up the forest was. And he literally runs the biomass plant, you know, and his family had been here for generations. So really getting out in front of it is always a good strategy, I think. And again, creating those pathways so stakeholders don't feel the need to go out and do it on their own, that they have support to communicate, even messages you don't agree with, just so they know that, again, you know, assuming that good intent, that you see some concerns and running out and doing it. But again, if they're doing it in a way that doesn't sabotage things, you know, I think if a stakeholder is trying to capitalize on a mistake of someone, that's always problematic. You know, find the fix, not the fault, is a good solution.
And Sarah, because I know you've got some great lessons and things to share up there in Tahoe, but could you speak a little bit to the role of public agencies in this, where you've got a landscape where it's got federal lands, but you've got an incorporated town or other types of jurisdictions all on top of each other? How do you figure out who is the lead? It may be great if the Forest Service could do it, but they've got very limited capacity in that space. How do you figure out who becomes that authoritative, definitive voice? To Neil's point about the newsletter, or where the credible information is coming from.
Yeah, those are great questions. First of all, I think our bears might be petitioning for citizenship and voting rights. I'm not sure, but we have a lot of them.
Do not tell our bears what your bears want to do, because it's sort of a union thing, but
yeah, they'll probably get together.
Yeah.
So it's a great question about, you know, how do you decide who's in charge? I think, you know, we have there's a couple of answers. One is we have a project charter, and so that defines all of our teams and all of their roles, and, you know, who's making what decisions kind of at what level. Really what it comes down to is, it is a very agency-driven process. So the agencies, you know, we have stakeholder engagement, and some of the decisions are made, you know, explicitly with those stakeholder teams. But in our charter, it's defined that it really does come back to our agency convening partners. The Forest Service, California Tahoe Conservancy, Tahoe Regional Planning Agency are kind of the three big ones, since they're leading up the environmental document. But then at that executive level table, we also have California State Parks, the Tahoe Fire and Fuels team, and I think that's it. I might be missing one, but I think that's it. And so that's kind of where the buck stops. But it's still a collaborative group, right? That means that agency executives still have to agree with each other. And so it's a very, that requirement of collaboration is built in. Is there another element of your question that I'm missing, or does that kind of help answer it?
It kind of helps answer. And I'm thinking about what Neil's talked about in Flagstaff with the city. You know, there was buy-in from the city. The city was putting money, you know, they were voting for bond measures to do that. And I think where we're at, Janet's done a remarkable job, and Nathan and all the members of the team kind of bringing this forward. But I think we're going to have to start looking about getting jurisdictional buy-in. I mean, we're dealing with some CEQA issues because, well, is there actually going to be a CEQA decision? Because is the county going to be actually doing anything? Or is it all going to be the Forest Service? It's sort of in a muddle. But I think it's going to be important to bring the town and the county into this, so that there is that type of local California state agency buy-in, so we don't get into the situation that Neil's talking about, where there's information voids, and there's voids of information. We have the opposite. Our bears, the opposite of your bears, in that, but our agency is the opposite. We have one agency, or maybe there's two. You've got, you know, 26. So I think we can learn a lot from your experience up there. But I think that issue of an information void is something we're going to need to focus on and come up with
I would recommend you get your city and county involved, even at some level.
Yeah, and I think well, just the nature of this project, because this project completely surrounds a town.
Right.
And theoretically, given the land jurisdiction, you could say, well, this is just a Forest Service project. Town's not really involved in any of that.
There's no such thing as a Forest Service project anymore.
Exactly.
They don't have the resources.
No, exactly. But we have to, the community are going to be the beneficiaries, but they're also going to be the folks being most affected by it. So I think it's something we got to think about. Thank you all very much. Good. Yeah,
we've got about 10 more minutes. We can use it or lose it. So I'm happy to feature any other questions this group might have before we say thank you to our guests.
If you guys figure out what to do with biomass, send me a note.
We're working on it. Just the update for the group that the grant agreement with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to fund the biomass planning work has been executed, and that project officially will launch the first week of May. So it outlines some tasks to help us start solving with some consulting experts that will help us identify, a solution that's a commensurate with this project and what we expect from it. So that's hopeful that we got funded that money, and looking forward to that progress for sure.
We get kind of stuck in this world of the original process that allowed that 27 megawatt power plant to get its agreements about 7 or 8 years ago was under some sort of legislative effort around green renewable energy kind of things, and it's really not about green renewable energy as a focus. It's not likely a carbon neutral thing at all, because the efforts to get that material to the biomass plant require a whole lot of energy inputs. But at the same time, it is a renewable resource for us out here for potentially 30 to 40 years at a very large scale. But it's especially now that I'm working for a municipality, I love talking about the biomass problem with the people that are part of the landfill more than other foresters, because I feel like it's a waste management problem. It's really not some sort of forestry problem.
Yeah, well, we have our own issues there.
Celebrate your win.
Right.
Then move on. Get people recharged.
Well, great. I don't see any questions from others in the group. I just want to say thank you so much to each of you. I know you are balancing a very considerable load, so making time in your schedule is really noted and appreciated. And I hope that we can I took lots of notes. I hope others did too, and I hope we can take and put that to good use. And I look forward to sharing our celebratory story someday.